And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Real Estate Show on KCMX News Media 880. Pete Belcastro and Joe Brett, the Real Estate Guys, with you today. And thanks for joining us as we entered the month of June, some of the busy real estate months of the year. And boy, we got a great show today for you. Rick Harris, who is he's the past president of the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors, who sponsors, by the way, today's show, and the past president of the Oregon Association of Realtors. And as we know, because he's been with us before, deals up there in the National Association with stuff too. So, and thank you for joining us today here.
Happy to be here, Pete.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, Joe, when I was a kid, I remember when the Fair Housing Act was passed. It was a big deal, if you remember. I was in high school, and I heard Rick speak at an MLS meeting that I was at a little bit about the 50th anniversary of this act. And the question became, is it relevant today? Do we still need something like that in our country? And he spoke really passionate about it. And so he said, Rick, you got to come and do a show with us about it, right?
Well, that's exactly right, Pete. So, April 11th, 1968 was the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And why it was important to me at that point, I was one of 7 kids with a single mom. And in 1968, my mom could not buy a house on her own because she wasn't married.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, until after the Fair Housing Act, we didn't have equal credit, so you couldn't necessarily go to the bank unless you had your husband or perhaps your dad had to sign on your behalf.
Yeah.
And so I was directly impacted. Now, I'm not your normal fair housing target here. I'm just a white guy like a lot of other people, but bottom line about it, it affects every single family. I have a brother that's gay, as a matter of fact, and so he lives in Southern California, can buy a house, can own property, but there are parts of the country where he can go and try to live, and he'll be discriminated for his housing choices because of his sexual orientation.
So the Fair Housing Act was, when it was implemented, did it bring the word protected class? It's the first time I remember reading, I guess, seeing that in school book. I mean, that kind of thing. Did that begin over housing? Is that actually where that protected class thing started?
Well, I think the idea about protections for various classes of people is a recognition that there were people being left out of the American dream.
Okay.
And so when you think about this, you're saying, well, who has the baseline of equal opportunity to buy a house? And generally speaking, it's people who are more affluent, people of particular race or gender. And so they identified 7 particular areas where there were problems that came. Not the first time that happens. You'll remember in the teens, the 19 teens, we had an entire unprotected class, that was women, who didn't have the right to vote.
Right.
And so in the 1800s, we had an entire class, that is people of Afro-American descent, who were not allowed to, well, they're not allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to actually be free. They were still slaves.
Right.
And so this idea about protected class is a way to identify places in our law, in our practice, where people are not getting equal opportunity. And that's really what the Fair Housing Act was about, equal housing opportunity, whether buying or renting, for everyone.
Now, I would assume that after that passed, that changed real estate. I mean, did it? How much did it change the country in this world? What did it do?
So a number of different things that happened. First, in the 1960s, we were in the middle of very turbulent times.
Oh, yeah.
War going on, a lot of civil unrest, a lot of racial unrest going on. And those were over issues about people of equal financial capability. Would come to town and they'd want to buy a piece of property. One was white, one was black, one was white, one was Asian. They were treated entirely differently.
Just treated differently.
They were treated differently. They didn't get the same opportunity. Rents might be different depending upon your age or your gender or your race. And so the idea was to create a level playing field in that regard. So it began to change, did not change overnight.
No,
so here we are, the 50th anniversary, and the National Association of Realtors made a big deal about this, and they did because we've been participants throughout. In 1968, the National Association of Realtors was originally opposed
to this,
to the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah.
And the reason because it was
why do you think that was
different. Well, because
it was change,
kind of, but it was also practice. At that point, it was okay to do what's called redlining, where people would live in one part of town if they were a particular economic class or a particular race, and people would live on the other side of the tracks.
And that's where that kind of came, didn't it?
And
so
exactly
realtors
right.
were
the
actually
process would steer them towards those neighborhoods.
Exactly
so
right.
realtors would steer because that's what the buyers in those times wanted, or whatever, right?
Sellers as well,
Or
yeah.
sellers, I suppose.
Somebody
too.
might call and say, I'd like to rent your place, and they might hear a tone in your voice that says, oh, I think this is a person of a particular race. Suddenly that property was no longer available to rent.
Yeah.
Or people would come to the real estate office and say, I'd like to go here, and they'd say, well, here's a list of the properties you might like,
Yeah.
or a neighborhood you might
Right,
like.
right.
So for the National Association, we had a lot of correction that had to happen internally. And so it took us a while, but then we became advocates, and we became strong advocates. We built it into our National Code of Ethics. The fair housing laws are entrenched in real estate law, real estate practice,
Right.
and for the realtor, within our code. So the protected classes are there are things that you might expect. Can't discriminate based on age or
On
race.
age. Okay, let's go through those again.
Okay, so
Start.
age is one,
Age. So if you're an older person or a younger person,
or a younger person.
and you want to buy it covers renting too, right?
Any use of real estate, the ability to
use?
buy
Okay.
or rent or lease
Okay.
real estate has to be on an equal footing.
And is it only just housing? What about commercial? Does that
Absolutely.
It
yeah.
does too. Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't know
any
that
form
part of it.
real
Okay.
estate is covered within this, and so
Okay.
age is one.
Age.
Race certainly
of course,
is one.
certainly.
Now, interestingly, they distinguish race and color as a different one.
Okay.
So, and I think the difference being is that if you think about biracial families, for example,
oh.
there's a whole range of whether I'm black
Sure.
or whether I'm light brown or whether I'm lighter brown if I'm this race, or so it depends upon not only where you come from, what your physical background is, but also what race you classify for. And then
Geez,
there's
yeah.
one more within that, which is national origin. So those three are distinguished because, as you know, today we have a travel ban on people of particular
Right.
origin from 7 countries in the Middle East. Well, that's a national origin-oriented
Right.
issue. So age, race, color, national origin, sex. Are you male or female? And in today's world, you might be somewhere in
Right,
between,
right.
and that becomes a greater issue. Religion.
Religion.
There are conditions, covenants, restrictions, neighborhood conditions today left over from a long time ago, but today they will still include things that say if you're of this particular faith, you can't belong here.
Ah.
And that might be Jewish, that might be Catholic, it might be Muslim. Your religion is also protected in terms of your
that
right
kind of
to
flies
use
in the face
housing.
of our founding principles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and many people go there saying, are we this race, or excuse me, are we this religion as a country? Are we this religion? And the answer really is that we're here to be open for people of all religious
okay,
faiths to
all right,
come.
yeah.
And then 2 more. Handicap. Now,
Oh,
it's
sure.
an
Okay.
interesting
Yeah,
piece
yeah,
about the
yeah.
protection there, because when it was first identified, it had to be, well, what does it mean to have equal housing for handicapped
Right.
people? Because is it a mental handicap? Is it a physical handicap?
Sure.
Is it an emotional handicap? All of which can qualify.
Okay.
And so subsequently, after the Fair Housing Act, there came the Americans with Disability Act. And that was after we'd identified that handicap was a protected class, it needed clarification.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, perhaps you have a 2-story building that doesn't have an elevator in it. Is an elevator required in every situation? And so another term came, what's called reasonable accommodation.
Oh, that's okay. Right. I
So
remember that.
somebody wants
Yeah.
to rent your house and they're in a wheelchair. They have the right under the law, both in the Fair Housing Act and under the American with Disabilities Act, to be able to make modifications that are reasonable to accommodate living in that situation.
right.
But it doesn't mean that everybody has to put an elevator in if
Right.
you're a 2-story. You might have to put a ramp in, might have to allow for doors to be widened, you might have to allow for other things to be adjusted. So that's 6.
Okay.
And then the last one is the one that I'm really quite passionate about, and that's familial status.
That's family status.
Family
right?
status.
Okay.
And so if you think about it, well, I don't want to rent to kids.
Oh, right. Okay.
Can't possibly have that. Well,
Single moms.
a single mom with 7 kids, where are we going to go? Or in our case, we could rent a house, but we could only rent it from a family friend. And if you think about it, that kind of discriminatory behavior happens today, because I wouldn't like to have little kids who might beat up my house in there. So perhaps I'll just say this is really more of an adult-oriented house. That by its nature is discriminatory.
Okay.
So those are the 7 classes.
Right. And haven't realtors gone beyond that?
Oh my gosh,
and
yes.
like added some things, because as they got into this, they found out that there was more discrimination in housing than was originally thought in some things, right?
Well, and there's
with great vision, they knew that these were principles that were going to sustain our industry going forward, allow us to serve clients properly, and align ourselves with the vision of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. There are some things there that are bearing fruit slowly but surely.
Yeah.
And as society changes, you have to recognize whether that discrimination expands. And so some things that were current but not as on the public stage in the 60s, things like sexual orientation.
Right.
Are you gay? Do you prefer men over women, women over men? The issue about that is, what does that have to do with your ability to rent a house
or own a house?
And the bottom line about it is that the 7 protected classes in federal law don't deal with that.
Right.
Oregon law a little bit differently. They recognize the fact that we want to have an equal society, and that who you love is not necessarily any impact on your ability,
to
for
own and
rent,
pay for a
or
house.
own.
And
And
that's
so-
really smart. And it's really probably the best thing that came out of that.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly right. And
Yeah.
so as society changes, we have to look for those who are not properly protected.
Yeah.
And so the 2 additional ones that both realtors, and this is the case in the state of Oregon, have protection, and those are sexual orientation and gender identity. And gender identity is one of those that's an emerging issue.
Right.
It's not that it hasn't been there, but it becomes more publicly available, and quite frankly, been discriminatory based on what you believe your sexual or what you believe your gender identity is.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look into that. And we got a break coming up here, and we're talking, by the way, with Rick Harris from the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors. By the way, Rick also is the broker of Coldwell Banker Pro West Real Estate in Ashland. I might add that. And has been here before. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the market, a little bit more about fair housing, and we'll kind of wrap that up. It's a fascinating topic that we need to remember today. When you're buying or selling, or if you're a buyer and a seller, you need to know these things and remember them, because you don't want to get yourself in trouble. Be smart about all this stuff. I think,
I'm
right?
glad every time we have to take our ethics refresher, because it really underscores those values.
Yeah. And the reason Rick, this flows out of Rick, this flows out, he knows this comes out of him. He also is an instructor for continuing education for realtors, and teaches the Code of Ethics course. And I might just say that I've taken classes, many from him, and believe me, he is one of the top persons who teaches.
Gives back much to our industry.
Yeah, and you're getting a real treat of and you're getting a real treat today of this.
June 29th is the next class.
So realtors remember that, because they only do it once a year or something like that. We've got a break coming up. We're with Rick Harris. We're coming right back. The Real Estate Show continues after this. And welcome back to the Real Estate Show here on KCMX. Pete Belcastro and Joe Brett, the Real Estate Guys, with you. Don't forget, you can check out any of our past shows at realestateshowOregon.com. Next week here on the show, we're going to delve into the rental market. We haven't done that for a while. Investing, is it still smart to invest in rentals? He says yes. I know our guest does today. Says that, I know. And what's the rental market like today? We're here, it's flattening a little bit. So that'll be next week here on the show. Today we're with Rick Harris from the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors, owner-broker, also a Coldwell Banker Pro West in Ashland. Fair housing, before we end this thing, it's still relevant today. That's the thing that I get out of this, is still really relevant to all of us. And we're not a discrimination-free world, I think, as we find out.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and a couple things else that I wanted to add to that, that these laws are not just applicable to real estate agents, but they're also applicable to the clients that we serve. So if you're selling a house and you would like a realtor not to sell to somebody of a particular class or particular color or race or so on, that is discriminatory, and that's an illegal ask that we simply can't follow. When you're selling, renting as an owner of property, you are also subject to these same rules. So I have some rental property. I have a property manager who does this for me, and they are quite careful in making sure that we meet all of the fair housing requirements, as every owner of property should be when they're renting or selling a property. And then lastly, it's just a reminder for buyers of what they should expect. They should expect equal treatment under the law. They should expect to have the full range of properties to look at, no matter if, as long as it's in their price range, things that they can afford. They should see everything in that. No matter which community, which part of town, they should get to see those. They should expect that they get proper notice about things, that they're treated appropriately. And then most importantly, because there's little bits of adjustment that are happening here, that when you're borrowing money, the Fair Credit Act came after that, where people were in prior times being charged different rates, different interest rates,
different,
different upfront costs, depending upon
on your color or your religion, if you any of those things,
your family status. That also was a great outgrowth, that the opportunity to borrow funds for housing became more level across the country. And it's important that we keep an eye on that, because things like Community Reinvestment Act that every bank has to comply with came as part of that. And it's important, as housing gets more expensive, more diverse, that we have those opportunities in our credit borrowing situation to be able to make that work. So just a couple of other pieces
for it to be a
why it's so
level
relevant
playing field
to us, that we keep watching these ideas.
I've got one final question for you. Is there a lot of complaints filed over this today? Do you know? There really are.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, is there any particular? Is it in certain parts of the country, or is it kind of generally all over?
You know, it's all over the place.
All over
there
the
are
place.
parts of the country where certain kinds of discrimination may happen.
Okay.
But as an example, a few years ago, the newspapers were all presented by housing advocates with a list of words that you couldn't advertise with, things like view and family and so on. And the reason for that, they're looking for discriminatory behavior. So if I ran an ad that said no families, that's on its face discriminatory. If I run an advertisement that said adult-oriented community, that might be seen as discriminatory. That is redlining against people with families. And so it's important to know that we keep tabs on it, that that when there are complaints to be made, if you have an issue of discrimination, there's a fair housing office in Oregon, there's a fair housing office through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and you can report it to your local real estate board, because you don't want any of the professionals out there acting in a discriminatory manner.
Absolutely.
So happens, unfortunately. We work to have it not happen. There should be places for people to go and complain, and there are, both at the state, national, and locally.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know. That's amazing stuff, and it's pretty simple too. You know, be fair to everybody. Treat everybody, isn't it funny? Treat everybody equally, everybody fairly, and you don't have a problem, right? But we still can't do it.
We're evolving from a society that didn't do a very good job of that, but we're trying to do better, and I sincerely see that in most of the people around us.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
We're still working at that, aren't we? We'll never maybe get there. Anyway, while we have Rick here, we want to talk about the real estate market, because here we are in the first part of June, and Rick's out there in the middle of this thing. You know, he's doing some big projects and things. We're going to talk with him a little bit about that in a little bit, but just overall here, I mean, the MLS stats, by the way, will be out next week. We'll be able to check those out from March, April, and May. So tell me what you're thinking. Tell us what you're thinking right now as we enter June here.
Well, we had kind of a wet spring. We had a little bit of laziness, and it's although somebody turned the switch and suddenly the market is just crazy. So I've seen in the last several weeks multiple offers on multiple properties. That prices continue to rise. People are having a challenge as there have been more buyers in the market. That tends to, and fewer sellers, tends to push pricing up. Interest rates peaked a little bit, but the Fed just came out and said they might be done for the rest of this year.
Well, that would be actually good. That would be a good thing. Remember
adjustment that changed the affordability.
Because remember, when you go up in interest rate, it takes people out of the market, or you get your buying power is reduced out of that. So
exactly right. And so the activity level's been very strong. Lots of new stuff coming to the market. lots of buyers in the market at this point. We're getting to that place right after Memorial Day when school's going to be out,
school's
families
out.
thinking
Tourists
about
here to come.
relocation.
Yeah.
And so, great time to be a seller. Really hard time to be a buyer.
Yep.
And if you're a seller who wants to sell and then buy in the same market, that's a tough place to be because it's easy to sell your house. Sometimes it's hard to find a replacement.
How are you dealing with clients? Because that's a hot topic in terms of contingent offers right now. Because so many, again, I'm going through this in selling mine. I did find another place. I was lucky, but people are having to put contingent offers on it. How are you treating that for the sellers because of the buyers? Because it's a big thing right now.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's always the seller's decision about how they feel. And so if they're faced with a single offer to deal with, then they may consider that.
Okay.
And I'm working on a contingent offer right now, a fellow selling in Central California, buying a condominium. And that seemed to work for the seller in that situation. I wrote an offer 2 weeks ago for a couple that have a home in this neighborhood, Northwest Medford, that wanted to buy in Ashland, had a house to sell. It would be well priced and go quickly. Competing offer, and they didn't win because the other person didn't have those contingencies.
And Joe's had a few. Joe's had a few of those.
So it really depends on the seller's interest and the seller's need in that situation. But as you get an offer on property where there are competing offers, makes it harder and harder to be able to put the two ends together, sell my house and then buy my new house. I don't want to sell my house before I move out of it. And so the challenge with it is trying to get those two ends to come together.
So you're saying the prices are still kind of inching upwards. Then we were talking about that. Have we reached that peak? Have we topped out? And
so interestingly, we're a feeder market. That is, people from California, people from Seattle, people from the East Coast are selling in an environment where they continue to see that market go up. I would agree with you. It's slowing in its rise in pricing, but I continue to see new things come to the market that maybe were on before and they've inched the price up some.
Sure.
And then also, when you get offers that are in a multiple offer situation, that by its nature, the competition between buyers will sometimes push that price up. And I have two of those on the table right now. One pushed up the price by about 3%. One pushed up the price by 10%.
Wow.
But it was competition on a very unique property. So what I would say about the market is pretty volatile. Still, lots of buyers. Fewer sellers, which makes for a strong seller's market.
Inventory increased. And we have certainly had it. We needed it. It has increased these last few months. That's for sure, but not at a pace that's needed though, because there's more buyers than there still are sellers, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We was doing a study in talent for some new construction needed in talent. The city did a study that said they needed 65 new houses a year to keep up with demand and so on. And up through last year, they were producing 6 to 9 per year. And so they understood it was a problem, and that's loosened a bit. But cities are having to deal with the requirement to bring more inventory to the market. And that's been a challenge.
Now Joe goes. He attends all these planning commission meetings. There's no life with those things. From Grants Pass to Medford to Jackson County, Josephine County, you go to those. Anyway, you were talking about some of the projects coming up, right? And you see these, right?
Well, there's a housing advisory commission that's coming together in Medford that has all the players in the game coming to the table to address ways. They're talking about the construction excise tax model on what they're doing in Bend to stimulate funds to stimulate affordable housing. And they're looking at what each other are able to do in these different municipalities and counties and how you can approach those problems. And we all agree that there's a shortage of housing overall, but also the shortage for affordable housing. And as you have poignantly pointed out on our program here, most of the new construction is to the normal traditional K2 models.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, Rick, do you see the more future development coming. We got another break coming up here. We'll talk about it more so. But do you see the future of more of this kind of thing coming up? City of Ashland has divided, the cottage ordinance now, where you can make tiny little lots, tiny little houses on these things, and you can easily divide your lots up. Do you like that kind of approach too? Do you think it'll work?
Well, I'm not sure that the division of lots is really what's going on, but the addition of a cottage onto an existing lot.
Right.
People have talked about the tiny house concept
Right,
there.
and you had shows on that.
And the challenge, of course, for everybody is the amount of available land within urban growth boundaries and city limits.
Okay, yeah.
And that's really been where some of the challenge has been. So there's the concept of infill. We'd like to go to existing properties, and how do I maximize the footprint on existing properties? That might be adding a second little unit, or taking a property that might be qualified for a certain number of houses and say, let's upzone that so that it can have higher density, so that the amount of available land will support a greater number of houses.
Okay, do you see people, do you see homeowners doing that?
I see homeowners doing it a tiny bit.
A little bit.
It's not widespread. And what you have to understand is it's great in concept, but this is the market now talking, and the market is really buyers and sellers. It's not me, it's not you, it's buyers and sellers. And what they say is, what do I want? Do I want to all live on tiny little lots, then very vertical houses with no space around me? And so in many parts of the country, that's how they live. In many parts of the country, it's not. And we're right at that point of trying to figure out what has been a kind of suburban lifestyle and making a much more urban feeling lifestyle. And that works for some and doesn't work for others.
And we do have finite boundaries in our valley here where that's available to grow to.
Exactly right.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's real, but at least it's being worked on and talked about more so than I've seen it in a long time.
As it should be.
As it should be.
I was actually talking with the governor 3 days ago about state of Oregon's working to bring 7,000 affordable housing units to the state, and I said that's great start.
That's a great start.
Recognize when you spread those 7,000 out across the 4 million residents of the state, that doesn't go very far. We've got a lot of work to get done.
We've got a break coming up. One more segment. We're with Rick Harris. We're coming right back to KCMX News Media 880 right after this. And welcome back to the Real Estate Show here on KCMX. This first weekend of June, Pete Belcastro and Joe Brett, the Real Estate Guys, with you. Check out all of our past shows, realestateshoworegon.com. Some terrific past shows. And next week, we'll talk about the rental market and what in the world is going on there. We've watched it now for like almost 10 years here on this show, and it's amazing.
It's great if you've got one. It's tough if you're looking for one.
If you're looking, and rental prices and what rents are going for. I mean, home ownership, it makes so much sense, doesn't it, as this kind of a thing? Because you can get into a home easier than you can rent a house right now, almost. Sometimes. Anyway, I wanted to draw your attention to one thing. When you clean Joe can get a picture of this. When you clean your yards out, your debris, when you hire somebody or you do it yourself, there's a new law that goes into effect in Jackson County on July the 1st that you have to tarp. If you go over the top of your trailer or the back of your pickup and not tarped, it's a $1,000 fine. And the state police, Medford, Ashland, all the police departments know this because. And it was so funny. I went to the dump and they gave me this, and we're driving home, and here's this guy in front of us with the stuff flying out of the thing. I go, that's why. Yep. Anyway, it's a $1,000 fine in the beginning there. So don't let that happen. Tarp it. You got to tarp it.
That's going to change my practices.
Tarp it.
Wow. You just use the heavy limbs on top. And
won't do it.
Tarp the thing. Yeah. Anyway, we're with Rick Harris today. This program presented by the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors. And one of the reasons it's great to have Rick here is that we talk a lot about alternative housing and what can we do to make it different. I mean, something alternatively. Doesn't that make sense? Anyway, Rick is involved with the project Verde Village, and you may have heard of it. It was the Williams family. Greg Williams originally started that down by the Ashland greenhouses, and then it ran into trouble. Well, the recession hit, and everything happened to them, and I know you've been involved with that.
Exactly.
So Verde Village is really unique. And my question to you is, can it be adapted? Can Medford do this same type of development? Can Eagle Point, Central Point, or tell us what you think of that and what Verde Village actually is.
Well, I think absolutely that Medford, Central Point, Eagle Point, Shady Cove could all do developments like it.
Okay.
But they have to have the will.
The will.
And the important thing about Verde Village, as you said, Greg and Valerie Williams was family property.
Yeah.
They had this vision of having a highly energy efficient, solar oriented, small footprint community
Right.
in Ashland on property that had been their family for 100
Yeah.
years. And so they got started in the early 2000s, got it most of the way through, got it approved by the city as the highest energy efficient community in the state of Oregon.
Wow. Okay.
Top
I
one.
didn't know that part.
And of
okay.
course, the recession hit,
Right.
and it was financially unfeasible to build. Later on, they sold to KDA Homes and Suncrest Homes. That's Les Ayala and Charlie Hamilton, who took the development forward. And the concept in Verde Village is smaller footprint, so smaller houses,
Okay.
less size of lots, so that we aren't expanding out into, most of the lots in that neighborhood. The largest one I know of is 8,000 feet. Most of them are 5,000 feet or smaller,
Right.
and many of them are 2,300 square feet for the lot.
Okay.
So that also combined quite a bit of open space. And then it included a number of features that made it highly energy efficient and light footprint. So they did things like create bioswales through the neighborhood to collect storm water, to pre-treat it before it goes out into Bear Creek as part of the storm system. They do a process that's called Earth Advantage, and that's a program through the nationally, but it's designed to be highly energy efficient, but also to manage waste during construction, to manage stormwater during construction, to make sure that landscaping you put in is low impact, low water usage, to use sustainable materials where you can. And they are at the highest level, platinum, Earth Advantage Platinum.
Oh, wow. At the top. Okay.
And then the neighborhood did something else between Laz and Charlie, and that was that they also produce these houses that are called net zero ready. City of
homes.
Ashland
We've talked
buys
about
back
those,
electric power because it's a utility. And so they're designed to have enough solar access on the roof to be able to put photovoltaic panels that will generate as much electricity as you use.
As they consume.
So during the downtimes, you sell back to the city. To the uptimes, you pull in from the grid, so that your electric bill over the course of the year can be zero.
How big are the houses, Rick? How big are the houses?
So houses
generally?
there range. We had some houses in the first phase that were 598 square feet.
Those are like those are like tiny houses almost.
exactly,
like we've been talking about. The city of Ashland's 800 square feet is considered that or less. Okay.
Right. And then the largest house in the first phase was about 1,450
So
square
they are
feet.
smaller. Kind of,
In the second phase, we range from houses that are about 1,100 square
Okay.
feet, and the largest house, more traditional, is a couple of thousand square feet.
Tell us, have you sold them all? I know you sold some. Tell me what you've done. So was there? I guess the question is, was there demand enough for these homes?
So the first phase began in late 2016. We just sold the last two houses there. So then there were 24 in the first phase.
Okay. Wow.
The second phase opened up last December. We are halfway sold. Out of 27 houses.
And what do they sell for there?
Well,
it's Ashland, so the reality compared to every place else is not reality. But anyway, it's skewed a little bit there. But what do they sell for?
Exactly. So the small footprint doesn't necessarily mean a small price. So those sold between $230,000 at the least expensive. In phase one, the most expensive house was in the mid fours. In phase two, it begins in the mid fours.
So phase
and works its way up. Phase two is a larger section.
I was going to say
larger houses.
Larger houses and stuff. Did you feel you had to have larger houses? That was more of a demand, or why did you do that? Why did they do that?
So when the Williams designed this project in the early 2000s, they did it in three parts. The first part was donated land that they gave to the city that was built out in partnership with a housing advocate. Those are City of Ashland affordable housing units. There were 15. That was built before the downturn. So that was the first phase. The second phase was small footprint cottages, a lot of open space and shared space. That was sold, as I said, we just sold the last two. And phase three, or the third phase of it, was common open space, common walking trails, bioswales, water retention, high energy efficiency, and those little bit larger footprints, little bit more traditional in terms of the sizes, a little bit more traditional in terms of cars and so on.
It really would be really, and Joe, because you were at those hearings, I know, it would be really cool to see something like this in other communities that starts that thing, because you look at California, in 2020, you got to have all your roofs have to have solar, is that what it was? Solar panels on them?
Solar panels on the roof.
Things like that. So, that's coming, but it's only done in Ashland. I wish it would happen other places because it makes sense to do some of that there. Yeah, so something's out there.
The developers in the cities can work together and meet the market's needs.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the market will support it.
Well,
KDA has another project coming that'll be about a year and a half out that will include much more similar, 30 units with common space. The HOA is going to own 3 smart cars that the community can use jointly, so they can cut down on traffic and so on. So Ashland's a community that supports it, and others in Southern Oregon ought to consider it.
And at least they're all talking to each other about it now more, as you say, so they're talking more about doing this kind of thing. We're out of time. We got to go. We could talk about this for another hour or so here, Rick, but we got to go. So thank you for being with us. rharris@mind.net is his email address. You can find him at Coldwell Banker Pro West in Ashland. Today's show, by the way, sponsored by the Rogue Valley Association of Realtors, roguevalleyrealtors.org. That'll do it for today. We're back with you next week here on KCMX. Catch our shows at realestateshoworegon.com. You all have a terrific weekend. God bless you all. We'll see you back here next weekend for the Real Estate Show.